I'm going to be talking to political scientist Stewart Prest, who's a professor at Fraser University, about a couple of tweets he sent out recently talking about government messaging, government leadership in the Omicron phase of the COVID-19 pandemic. And his argument basically is that we're not getting the kind of leadership that we need, the direction we need, the information and so on. We're feeling kind of rudderless these days in this part of it, and that's not a good thing. So welcome to the interview, Stewart.
Thanks very much for having me on.
Look, I was really fascinated by the argument you put forward in the tweet. Maybe you could just summarize it for us here.
Sure. Effectively, we seem to be in the middle of something of a transition phase in the pandemic, perhaps moving towards a new stage, which there's some evidence that perhaps we're moving towards a more endemic phase of the coronavirus, where we're seeing a new wave, which is requiring fresh actions from government, but we're also seeing some evidence that governments, say in the United States and elsewhere, are shifting to a footing where we're learning to live with this virus and trying to find ways to open up our societies on an ongoing basis. But all of this is happening in the absence of any kind of large strategic direction from just about any jurisdiction. We're not just seeing it at, say, the federal level in Canada or the provincial level in Canada or the federal level in the United States. We're seeing it in jurisdiction after jurisdiction, this sort of messaging where it's just sort of hanging on, just get your booster and do your best. And that's just not enough for people to build any kind of plan for themselves about what they need to be doing now, why they're doing it now, and where this is all heading. And in the absence of that strategic vision, people are left to fend for themselves and essentially create their own narrative. And we're seeing some dramatically different interpretations of where we are and what should be happening as a result. And in one sense, you could say, well, this is great for deliberative democracy. Everyone gets to think these things through and on their own. They get to analyze the information, like we're always saying, on their own. But when we need to coordinate activities as a society, whether at the provincial level or the federal level, at some point we need to coordinate around a common vision for where we're going and how we're going to get there. And I just don't think we're getting that right now.
Well, my take on this, Stewart, and you and I both live in British Columbia, and the public health officer here is Dr. Bonnie Henry. And so when we first became aware of the pandemic in, say March of 2020, just we'll say for sake of argument, I thought the governments did a pretty good job across Canada and maybe less so in the United States, but nevertheless, in Canada, we felt that our public health officers were doing a good job. Then maybe a little less so in the second wave, and then perhaps arguably not in the third wave. The fourth wave this fall and was just a disaster in some provinces like Alberta, and not so great in British Columbia either. And it seems like that was kind of a turning point. I mean, it's just been the ship is now appears to be, it really feels rudderless to many ordinary citizens at this point.
Absolutely. And I think that idea that earlier in the pandemic, we had more of a sense from government about where we were and where we were hoping to get to in the near, medium, and long term, and with a lot of uncertainty built into that messaging, basically saying, well, we're here, we're at phase 1, phase 2, whatnot, and BC had the different phases, and each province had a variation of that, and saying, well, we're not going to move ahead until something happens with the virus. And we don't know exactly what that is, because this is an unpredictable situation. Clearly, we knew variants were going to come along. We didn't know they would look like Delta or Omicron. So we're continuing to have to be resilient and adaptive. But we still had a sense of, well, when things look like this, we're going to do this. And when things look like that, then we're going to do that. And we just don't have that kind of articulation from just about any government anymore, even though we do see some moves in different directions, and often contradictory moves at the same time, where we're continuing to keep up open some economic activities, but we're dramatically curtailing others. And just today, for instance, Ontario announced that schools are going to go back online, which is a dramatic change for any family with kids of school age. And so we're seeing this enormous, not exactly a lockdown, but dramatically strong, more stringent controls at the same time that other aspects of the economy are just going to continue to tick along. So we have this mixed messaging, and it just leads to a lack of coordination. And again, I think there are different explanations we could explore, and I don't know how much we want to go into that. It's pretty clear that governments are quite tired at this point. They're looking reactive because that's what they're doing. They have been responding in some kind of crisis mode for 2 years now. Health systems are, we know, suffering significant and prolonged attrition. People are just burning out in the system, and those are the experts on whom we rely to make these decisions. So there are some explanations for why we're here, but we still need to move ahead. And so I'm looking for governments to start to articulate some plan about what this stage looks like, why we're doing what we're doing, and then where we hope to get to in the near future.
Well, Stewart, let me lay a potential explanation, maybe a little hypothesis on you. We've done a number of interviews with different experts in different countries about public health and its relationship to the emerging science around things like airborne aerosol transmission of COVID-19. And it seems like the public health establishment going into this pandemic responded like it would. I mean, it has theories and it has policies and procedures and so on. And they applied those quite well, sort of in the first wave, the second wave. But then it turned out COVID-19 was unlike any pandemic we'd had before. We were kind of unprepared. And the Dr. Bonnie Henry, Dr. Dina Hinshaw in Alberta, other public health officers have been slow to react to the emerging science around how COVID-19 is transmitted and so on. And they haven't done a great job as a result. And that leaves the government in a bit of a quandary. I mean, if my experts are telling me things that maybe don't make sense or aren't showing the kind of results on the ground that we would expect, what do I do if I'm the premier? What kind of direction do I give? What's your take on that?
I think there's a reality to that these institutions they're trying to do two things at the same time. And I think we're seeing some evidence of trying to be aggressive in responses when that is called for. But there is also a kind of bureaucratic resistance to dramatic change, to dramatic action, to essentially risk aversion. That is a well-known feature of just about any public bureaucracy and private bureaucracy for that matter, right? Just trying not to do anything that will make matters worse. But at times like this, we need to be a little more aggressive if we are actually going to do that curtailing of an emerging wave, for instance. So why there's a great deal of criticism, and I think some of it is quite deserved of the Ontario government, their announcements today. Why are they doing this now? If these changes were necessary, that was clear 3 weeks ago. The curve was already clear. There's that cartoon that constantly circulates around Twitter of an exponential curve. At each stage of the curve, it's exponential growth, but we only respond to it as if it's exponential growth, and once it's pointing straight up. But so there's that risk aversion, not wanting to rock the boat when things are not yet dire, but that's not enough. And so I think there is this contrasting push-pull dynamic on any bureaucracy, not wanting to recommend the most dramatic action for fear of making things worse unnecessarily. But again and again, we're seeing that we need to be a little more forward-leaning, and that allows us to then move back to a more normal situation more quickly and forestall some of the strain that we continue to see on our health systems, where we see ICU numbers ticking up and so on.
Well, Stewart, let's wrap up this conversation this way. As a political scientist, someone who understands policy and how governments operate, what would you recommend, that our public health officials do, and what should our elected leaders do to try to get a better handle on this?
Well, I think it goes back to messaging, ultimately trying to give people that context within which all policies are being introduced, and really laying out in a transparent manner, what are we trying to do here? We're trying to maximize a couple of different things. It's not even clear what those things are, though, from one government to the next. Are we trying to maximize economic activity? Are we trying to maximize or minimize the presence in hospitals? Are we trying to protect vulnerable populations? Are we trying to protect unvaccinated populations? Are we trying to carve out normalcy for those who are double or triple vaxxed? We have different criteria that we're trying to achieve all simultaneously, and we don't even have a clear sense of what governments are trying to do at any given moment. So I think being clear upfront about those trade-offs and the inevitability of those trade-offs, and to try to give people some understanding about how they're balancing those out at each given moment, and how that leads to a certain set of policies at a particular point in time, which when we look at that larger context may not necessarily make sense. Like if it seems like we're moving to this stage where Omicron is just going to blow through the population, it's easy to give into a sort of cynicism and say, well, but maybe everyone should just get it and just get it over with, since it's going that way anyways. But we know that there are really important policy reasons why that's not a good idea. That can lead to the crumbling of an already creaky health system. We need to try to flatten that curve to ensure that we are maintaining capacities in hospitals and so on, even as we are at the same time thinking about what things may look like a couple months down the road, where Omicron, according to the best evidence we have, may ultimately provide additional protection alongside the third booster that people are receiving, or the second booster people are receiving. We may be moving towards a point where this is a more endemic condition, and we don't know when that's going to happen. We don't know for sure that that is going to happen. There are unknowns here, but we could at least lay out, these are the different scenarios. This is why we're taking these fairly dramatic actions at this point, even though when we look a few months down the road, the picture looks different. We've heard some public health officers like Dr. Bonnie Henry, in her year-end comments to CBC and elsewhere, started to muse along those lines. So we have heard that these ideas are clearly on the minds of public health officials, but they're not really being communicated in a succinct and what you could call official way. An end of the year interview is not the same thing as laying out a clear set of guidelines and expectations for, say, BC's public health office. And so looking forward, I would hope that we have that sense of what are we trying to do at time one, what are we hoping to achieve in time 2 and 3, and where are the uncertainties? Because there's plenty of uncertainties to go around, and I think everyone is aware of that. But just being upfront, being transparent about the decisions will help us all make sense of what is clearly a moment of transition and uncertainty, and at the moment, a great deal of confusion.
Well, Stewart, thank you very much for these insights. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure, anytime.